I believe we're going to begin with artist presentations. Rafik, are you going first?
Yes.
All right.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to the gallery, and great to be again connected with Parag and this beautiful day. And I think we are finally in a physical world after many Zooms. So, thank you for being here. I think we are in this show thanks to Jeffrey Deitch almost 2 years ago, I think, when we just encountered about the idea of why not there is no any solo shows in Los Angeles, and he was very right that for some reasons our work in the studio was traveling around the world, but not necessarily in Los Angeles. The only work that I was able to produce back in time at UCLA Design Media Arts Department, where I got my second MFA, and I was very fortunate with working very closely with Casey Rias, Christian Moller, and Jennifer Steinkamp, and pretty much every single faculty. I think very grateful for their wisdom and guidance. And one of the pieces that you may see on the corner, which is Walt Disney Concert Hall, which also with Parag we had a wonderful time to explore incredible archives of LA Philharmonic and Frank Gehry's Cultural Beacon. In the show, there are like four different body of work. 2016, first of all, 2008, I was fortunate to start working with a software called VVV, 4V, which is a visual programming language allows many creators to do things with sensors and data and information and find ways of creatively thinking with computers, I guess. But here we mostly see works from the last 6-7 years, starting with nature, I guess, much fundamental inspiration. I would guess if a Monet one day imagines the atmosphere, he is also imagining most likely a world that is back in time, how he was perceiving the life in general in input for his mind and consciousness. For me, what was very inspiring is what happens if you quantify the similarly weather conditions, such as a weather station, a simple weather data sets such as wind speed, direction, and gust, or the humidity or the rain condition of the city. So these three pieces on your right are focusing on the 12 months of our data collections in the studio with a weather station. We basically try to create 3 works from the 4 months of a 12 months of data collection from the wind data. Of course, they are arbitrary, heavily normalized data through the sensor. But what was inspiring to me was really fundamentally understand the things we don't see, but we know that exist, like making invisible visible, I guess. That kind of iteration is there. And then the other body of work I think is really fun to work was California landscapes. Like many of us, I'm sure, enjoying hiking and representing the nature in California in general. And Jeffrey truly challenged the question what is the LA life last 11 years? Me and my wife, Efsun, also the studio partner, together we have been living in this beautiful city, but pretty much many of us most likely inspired from the nature that every single weekend or any time. So we challenge ourselves and download around 153 million images of every 10 national park exists in California and train 3 different neural networks, generative adversarial networks, and upsample the data to 2K, which is very nerd part, but really hard to go beyond the existing model. So we have been exploring this model for now 7 years or 6 years, I guess. These are 3 works that inspired also the piece on your left, which are drawing point and line, pretty much referring to, I guess, early software art and late 60s and early 70s, and pretty much since AI can know the last and now and the next frame, the whole idea was can we just highlight this moment of remembering both, I guess, direction of the time at the same time moment. And then the other piece on the very right side on the corner is similarly using the similar inputs, but this time this data pigmentation, last 10 years, exploring what happens if you go, what happens if data doesn't dry as a pigment, and how we can use fluid dynamics as a mean of expression. Study for now, I guess, 10 years, that's going still. And lastly, on your left side, on the corner, is a Pacific Ocean study, started with Bosphorus, 2015, using high radar frequency data from NOAA data, website. There's another, again, algorithm trained on a year-long activities that are driving the force of that simulation. And the piece on this room, if you had a chance to see, is 2016, unfortunately started by knowing my uncle's Alzheimer's disease. And It was a time that I was able to connect with Adam Gesley from UCSF, an amazing neuroscientist who have been creating games to cure ADHD and anxiety and Alzheimer's and many challenging diseases. He's an amazing team at NeuroEscape, and he trained me and our studio, which I will come at the end, to explain us how we can use certain data sets from the EEG, specifically brain sensor, to detect the 3 points of time negativity in the memories or the moment of remembering, and the positivity, and if possible, the meditative states, which are relatively more easier to detect because otherwise you have a very significant noise and hard to predict and measure moments. And he also allowed us to use a special machine called Empatica. Rosalind Picard from MIT, she invented the affective computing, and thanks to her, we learned how to also quantify the heartbeat, skin conductance and blood pressure, and they are really enough to talk a lot about the moment of remembering these data sets. And the infinity room here is a box, which was another Jeffrey's think that this corner should be about student life and what happened in when come to LA. And Jennifer Steinkamp was an incredible mentor, and she truly challenged. The first thing was going beyond comfort zone as a student. Of course, I couldn't build a room like this as a student, but took one of the labs at DMA and turned the walls into the infinity room. And right after the graduation, it was the first design, super DIY, ultra affordable gears, but thanks to Epson, they donate these 4 projectors, which used also at UCLA at the EDA room. So that's a very first immersive room. So that's the works we are here, and happy to share more.
What happens if data doesn't dry? Maybe it becomes flow. If you know me, you know I'm especially interested in this BCI, brain-computer interface device piece around the corner, and I want to introduce Parag Mital, who is going to show a couple of his works, and I just can't help but mention that Parag also has a piece with an fMRI machine, which is also using brain data as training sets, as ways to talk about the intersection between our bodies and technologies. So I'm super excited about the intersections between the work of these 2 artists, and I'd like to invite Parag now to show a couple of his pieces on the screen.
Thank you so much. I have written my talk because I am very nervous, and that's what's going to happen. Thank you, Asia Society, Refik, Jeffrey Deitch Gallery, so much for making this happen and the opportunity to share my work. My practice has really revolved around fundamental questions of perception, such as how do we represent our ongoing scene viewing? Could these representations ever be modeled by computers? And if they are, how does that differ from our own? Could we gain any knowledge, or do we lose any differences as a result of those models? These questions have led me to explore scientific research in eye tracking, EEG, and fMRI, as well as computational modeling using computer vision and AI, and my arts practice as well via generative films, installation artwork, archival browsing, and augmented realities, which take the analyses or models built in the scientific setting and tries to extrapolate those to decoding and synthesis, and that's where a lot of the kind of gaps in understanding of what's missing in the theories kind of become a little more apparent. So by creating some sort of computational perception, listening to media or viewing an archive, we can start to understand really the underlying process and provide some more insights there. The starting point for me was really with eye tracking and working with visual cognition. And eye movements are fascinating. They're a real-time index of cognition. So 3 to 4 times a second, you're moving your eyes 3 to 4 times a second. It led me to think about how is it that we're able to feel that the world is so continuous and rigid, even though if you took a camera and you did that 3 to 4 times a second, it would be wild. No computer could really understand that, but we're able to do that. And so part of the theory was first you had to collect the data, and so from 2007 onwards, I collected over 200 videos of human eye movements from over hundreds of participants in each video, and started building models. I did the same for audio as well, by looking at what the contribution of audio was to how our scene perception changed via eye movements, and later validated these experiments with EEG and fMRI as well. So what you're looking at here is one of the early computational models, and this was really just built on an understanding of motion. This was an early audiovisual experiment in 2010. You might recognize some of the work here if you're familiar with visual music. And this is Michael Figgis's time code, and this was the basis for one of my first artworks, which was a generative film that was really interesting work. Okay, so 2010, archival practice. This was my entry into thinking about how can I use these models now to analyze larger archives. In this case, it was working with Daphne Orme Archive. If you're unfamiliar with her work, please do yourself a favor and check her out. I see some head nods. The idea was to help archivists in 2010 understand what was in all of this data. They had just recovered all these film reels from a barn in France. It was collecting dust, and they really wanted to know about her legacy. And so this was an opportunity to use this model and really try to disentangle the representations in that archive and have fun while doing it by creating an interactive instrument as well and a tool for archivists. Later in 2018, working with Refik, working with the LA Phil, looking at 4 million audio fragments and 7 terabytes of audio representing the last 100 years of the LA Philharmonic. In the same vein as with Daphne Orme, here I was applying auditory models capable of listening to the entire archive, pulling out representations that it finds meaningful and organizing the collection into a representational space that can be used to browse, annotate, or even play the archive. And so working with Rafik's team, helping to structure that data, once it was in a structured format, then the auditory models could build this representational space, which Rafik's team took and made the most incredible public art piece, symphony that I don't know has ever existed. Aside from building interactive browsers of archives, I've also explored synthesis of them. So the same models I've spoken about were applied here in 2013 to 2016 to build an artwork called YouTube Smash Up. The idea here was to try and infect YouTube with a generative virus where I would try to learn to create the #1 most viewed video on YouTube by resynthesizing it, but I would only use content from the remaining top 10 videos. And I would keep doing it, maybe forever, until it landed in the top 10 and resynthesized itself and proved itself a success. I also did it with Miley Cyrus here. I don't know if you recognize it. But unfortunately, I had to stop the project because I was subject to so many copyright infringement claims. Yeah, and they also locked me out of my Gmail, so I couldn't use, because Google and YouTube are buddies, you know, so. In this case, it was the musical arrangement for Miley Cyrus, and I'm not sure anyone, if you had actually listened to it, would have ever guessed it was the musical arrangement. But to a robot, it is. So what happens when you receive too many copyright infringement claims is you get locked out of your Gmail and you have to watch this ridiculous video of Happy Tree Friends. And they make you take a quiz, like they quiz you on the contents of this video. And I don't know if you're familiar with Happy Tree Friends. They're really violent, like blood and gore. So that's what YouTube was about. But I learned a lot about the disjunct of human and robot perception through this work. And what happens when you put them in systems of automation, which are effectively, subjective metrics. The last 2 works I'll share are clips from longer pieces, which will also be screened after the talks, or you might have caught it before. These works really represent kind of the next stage of evolution of the models for me. And considering a lot more is capable with today's computing, I've been able to basically troll over a lot more data and build much higher resolution syntheses. And so this kind of just marks the next stage of work for me, really. This next work is called The Road to Bareilly, and it documents a recent trip my family took to visit my mother's hometown in India. Throughout this talk, I've described the process of perception as though it's some arbitrary or generic human entity, but really the process I've been so obsessed with is understanding my own perception. And the question I really should be asking is, why am I so confused by my own perception that I've embarked on this ridiculous quest for the last 15 years to try and model it? In the video, if you listen to the audio, my mother, who's now lived in the US longer than in India, is reflecting on the hometown in which she grew up in, and how it's been turned from a jungle that she once knew into a metropolis where there's no space left. And at the same time, I'm myself reflecting on this moment and trying to reconcile my own Indian roots that I feel detached from. My confusion is really well known. There's actually a term for it, ABCD. The Indians in the room will know it. American-born confused Desi. I recently learned that my mom also calls me this to my other family members, the confused Desi. But in this moment, I was reminded that our experiences and struggles aren't really generic, but deeply personal and complex. And for me, the video series explores sacrifices made by immigrants and their children, as well as challenges of reconciling one's roots with one's present. And so with that, I'd just like to say that through my art and research, I continue to try and explore nuances of perception and representation, and how they intersect with our identities and experiences. And this last work is probably the most personal work I've ever shared, and one I'm still unpacking, but I think it's a testament to the power of art to provoke self-reflection and understanding. So thank you again so much. Thank you, Refik. Thank you, Asia Society. Thank you so much, Jeffrey Deitch, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Parag. Devang, I'd like to invite you to introduce your role with Christie's Ventures.
Sure. I think first and foremost, I just want to say it's an honor to be here. So thank you, Asia Society, Anjali and her team, as well as my own leadership team here in LA, Stephanie, who's invited me to come out here to sit between two so talented artists, Rafik, who I've known for a little while, the maestro himself, and Parag, who I'm getting to know now and am inspired by. I am nowhere sort of close to these gentlemen. I call myself the nerd from the Pacific Northwest because I've flown in here from Seattle this morning, where I spent most of my adult life building technology that powers some of this stuff. I spent 15 years at Microsoft before stepping into the art world, building operating systems to search engines to artificial intelligence software that powers some of this stuff. But to your point of where does art and tech intersect, I think it intersects here in the walls of Jeffrey Deitch today. But I think Samsung or Sony had a very interesting quote 10 years ago that I'll use, which said, artists inspire and technologists create, right? And to use that example, if you look at written word by H.G. Wells hundreds of years ago, it had conceptualized a device that sounds a lot like a tablet or an iPad that wasn't invented hundreds of years ago. It was invented maybe 15 years ago that we all use today in our daily lives. And artists like Parag, Rafik, and Favocius, who some of you have seen his work, use those creative tools that technology has built as the next paintbrush or the next canvas, right? So technologists are enabling new tools based on the inspiration that artists provided hundreds of years ago, and the same thing is happening now. The artists of today are using tools like artificial intelligence or signal processing and sound to create new experiences that will inspire the technologists 10, 15 years from now to push the boundaries for what tech's going to be. And at Christie's Ventures, our goal is to sort of provide a platform, a neutral platform where artists, creators, technologists, big tech can all come together and sort of explore these intersections. And we feel that we are at a precipice, at a point now where the adoption of technology has become so fast. I think we were chatting the other day, Refik, that the latest Mac Pro that you have in your studio has 128 billion transistors, right? Just put that in perspective. Moore's law when he conceptualized in 1986 that computer had 300 or 386 transistors or whatever that was. They've multiplied every 2 years to now be 128 billion transistors on a computer. That, combined with the distribution powers of things like browsers and app stores, means that today's kids, my son who's 20 months old, is adopting technology at a speed that we've never seen before. And I think that is going to only continue through the next 15 or 20 years. And I think Christie's, a 256-year-old institution, has a role to play in bringing all of these different entities together. So that's what Ventures is all about.
All right, thank you. So our topic today for the panel is AI and art, how AI is changing art making and the art market, as well as the societal and cultural implications of that, which I think are inextricable. And we have 25 minutes. Thanks again to the Asia Society for hosting this panel and on this critical and timely topic. And thanks for Rafik, Parag, and Devang for sharing your work and expertise. I want to start by going back in time a bit. Rafik and Parag, you've both been working with AI for 15 years. And so very briefly, I just wanted to ask you to talk about your first meaningful encounter with machine learning. What led you to realize this was an instrument or tool that you wanted to pursue?
Oh, I have to think about that. That's a great question. I think I probably took my first AI course in 2004, and then from then on, I just kind of, it made sense to me, a lot of the rules and patterns and equation, things like that. But it wasn't until I saw artists working with that material that I thought oh, there's something here. I never wanted to be a programmer. I always thought my image of a programmer was oh, I have to be in a cubicle, and I don't want to do that. But that was what I was taught from a young age, and I didn't really see artists working with technology until maybe I had somebody basically believe in me, and I was well, I like computers, I know I'm good at it, but I really like music. And so she just put into the browser computer music. She's did you know that there's a whole conference and field dedicated to this stuff? I'm gonna send you there. I was okay. And I was very, very lucky to have that kind of insight and met all sorts of people making instruments, designing different sound synthesis techniques, things like that. And I was oh, I need to learn this. So my entry point was probably through sound and music, really.
I love that answer. And would you share who believed in you? I think mentors are so important.
Yes, Dr. Maria Polakis, and yeah, she's incredible. She ran a program in the University of Delaware where I did my undergraduate.
Rafik, what was your first meaningful encounter with machine learning?
I think is not practically maybe, but I think I was very much a child, 8 years old, when I watched The Blade Runner, which my first encounter with science fiction, not AI maybe, but the idea of a machine and a human and their context was, as a child without knowing English, my cousin was just translating the movie constantly, and I was trusting his words, and he promised he was doing a good job. But I felt something very positive. Maybe as a child, we all born with I hope more positive vision, perception of life, and I didn't see anything dystopia actually. I saw utopia. I saw hope, and I saw joy, and I saw inspiration, and I tried to keep it in me instead of leaving that behind. But then Space Odyssey, AI, and Ex Machina, and all that other sci-fi, I guess, effect was super powerful on me. But I will say, if I go back to undergrad years, 2009, graduation, I was so fortunate to work with someone we lost, Peter Weibel. And he's a very important figure in media arts, which is the founder of ZKM. And as a student, for my scholarship, I had to bring 300 artworks from ZKM archives, from Kars to Istanbul, to make an installations around media art very first time. But that 300 artworks, there was, I guess, 10, maybe more than them was exploring AI, but not necessarily this advanced way. But they were speculating about machine intelligence, I guess, not specifically AI. And all of those works, I think Jeffrey Shaw was exploring legible city, where you were able to like use a bike and create a route for your destiny. And he was speculating a lot of fundamentals of, I guess, free will and privacy for the upcoming society. But I would say another hero is Casey Rias, and in his class, it was getting more interesting. And graduation-wise, I will give big appreciation to Blaise Gary Arcas and Karen McDowell and Mike Taika. They were like three wonderful minds. 2016, February, allowed me to become an arts and resident at Google. And that was really unexpected for me because I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not coming from like deep technology of scientific thinking with machines, but the residency was so incredibly honest, open, that me and my team, by the way, our team members are written on the wall, recognize them. We are now 15 people, can speak 15 languages and 10 countries in a small studio, practicing last 9 years. And they were very important checkpoints that create impacts of our work and thinking with AI.
Thank you. And Devang, what was your first meaningful encounter with machine learning?
Machine learning for me reminds me back again to my Columbia days. If you've ever heard of this guy, Yoav Freund, who created boosting, he was my advisor. So if he's around, just let me know and I'll run because I dropped out a PhD program. But that was my first, like his mathematical foundations of machine learning class, which was the only class I got a B- in, was the first sort of exploration of machine learning. And this is 1999, by the way, like when back in the day when Yoav was still creating AdaBoost and the first versions of AdaBoost. Yeah, so I spent some time at Columbia, at Princeton, had this 3-month stint at the Institute of Advanced Studies where I was trying to apply some of these to game theoretical foundations of computation, basically at the very theoretical level, not at like practical levels like you guys. I was always in the concepts, you know. But then back in the day, I found I could apply machine learning to gaming, and which is why I went and interned at Microsoft that summer and fell in love with the Pacific Northwest and never came back to New York. So that's my machine learning story.
Thank you. So I want to lead up to talking about where everyone thinks this is going in the future, but on the journey, I want to ask how your opinions of the cultural impact of AI have changed over the decade and a half that you've been working with that material. And Rafik, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I think, I would say there's a couple of things that really makes the last 6 months more different than last 6 years, right? Like clearly, anyone working with the computation and specifically machine learning algorithms, for me, like 7 years feels like 70 years. Literally every morning, most likely in social media, somebody's making a breakthrough in their own domains. So it's not like a comfortable zone for an artist that's working with the same brush or a pigment and a gesso and a canvas or same materials that every single morning when you wake up, it's there. So I think this is really very interesting that happened to many people, I think, working with computation. Like the speed of like doing things, not only just on the machine locally, but on the cloud, but also open sourcing this information. I don't believe it's ever happened in the history of arts. I don't believe anywhere in any decades that artists were sharing, or creatives or technologists are sharing their know-how this instantly. I think this is an incredible impact. I don't know positive, negative, but it's an impact that we can quantify. The other part that I'm extremely enjoying personally, but seeing criticism is like this uncomfortable zone. Like you don't know what this tomorrow means for that algorithm. You don't have a feeling of this is my brush forever, or this is my pen or pencil or surface. It's a very different feeling. And I think this creates an uncomfortable zone, most likely. And for also creators working in an introvert context, it's a really challenging time because we are seeing the extrovert, like the moment of sharing and publishing and putting things out is another, I think, sometimes not fairly distributed across the many creators. So if we multiply all of them, I think this creates problems most of the time instead of solutions. So, but at the meantime, I'm seeing an incredible amount of creativity just because of open sourcing recent tools. They've never been, I mean, even like Parag, your amazing like lectures like have been when they are like all public. I mean, it's not anymore about not knowing. It's all about like other things. Yeah, and learning to learn became, I think, fundamental for many creators, which was not possible before, right? But also, the recent developments with generative AI, now a new name, I guess, for the entire AI field, that makes the things a little bit challenging. Like, I had a very deep discussion with an artist from the art station who have been complaining about, like, why my name is there, that someone that is just takes 3 milliseconds to make my work, while I spent 3 months. There is no single answer to this question. There is no way to say because of what. Mm-hmm. So when I felt that, I found myself really finally thought from an inner portrait of a person that how he or she or they're like seeing this world. I didn't see it before. While practicing every day in the studio, like working and crunching data or doing things, it gives you a blind perspective. But when you go out and start asking the questions, that's when I saw that actually there's not only just bright but dark side exists. So the question also goes to a little bit, one more answer, sorry, it's a long answer, but I think what I found also powerful is if you think AI as like an extension of mind, as like a tool that just enhances our cognitive capacity, it's exciting. But at the end of the day, it's a mirror context, right? If you go to like, this mirror is just reflects who we are. So I believe in me and the humanity, and I do believe it's good as I can imagine, but the world is big enough to make that mirror do weird things. So the question is, if artists are still remain the alarm mechanisms of things may go wrong or not. I hope we are. So I'm in the optimist side of the alarm to say good things, but I'm pretty confident many artists will create incredible work to bring out problems to society, to the surface.
Yeah.
If I could add, based on the comment I made earlier, I think just building upon your the speed argument that you're making, how fast some of these things are being adopted. I think, as I said earlier, computers got much faster over the last 2 decades, and also got much cheaper over the last 2 decades, right? While people were producing more computers and faster computers, they were also getting half the price every 5, 10, 15 years. I think what changed in 2007 was the App Store, right? The distribution along with App Store and GitHub, for developers for GitHub, but consumers with App Store, is so quick that while in the social era or the mobile era, it used to take virality to get your app from point A to point B, ChatGPT, which was released, I think, as you said, 6 months ago, has made it to 100 million users, which is like rural farmers in India are using ChatGPT to predict when to sow the next crops. Technology hasn't made that much fast leaps ever before in our lifetime, at least. I think this is the fastest adoption cycle we're seeing, and I think it only gets faster. And I think your point of like the double-edged sword is an important one to keep in mind, right? Like the speed at which these things are being developed, we have to also get smarter at detecting the dark sides if we can, you know?
Yeah, those are both great answers. I think definitely agreeing with the double-edged sword and thinking about maybe the sharper edge of that is increased automation. And while it's true that, you know, like I recognize that journey of like getting access to machine learning is, you know, there's no comparison to 15 years ago. It was so difficult. I remember I had to like email a researcher, hope that they would answer in 3 months, and then beg them like, could I have your source code? You're in MATLAB that like doesn't compile and it's like doesn't run at all. And then it was like try to figure it out, you know, like that was my journey with ML. And now it's like there's interfaces and you can just like run it on your phone or whatever, you know. And well, that's great, you know, like I think there's increased access there, but also it's interesting how like foundation models, these really large models that are controlled basically by 2 or 3 people are the norm now. And where does that kind of leave the creative capacity or the people that aren't encoded in those networks, where does it leave them and their ideas? So that's an interesting double-edged sword there as well.
But I think the optimism is very important, right? Like for the art market, if we think about if we take a step back from an institutional perspective, if you look at the size of the art market, it was between 2000 and 2008, it used to be somewhere in the 30 to 40 billion a year range, the total market in terms of annual transaction volume. Something happened between 08 and 15, which doubled in size, and that was the iPhone, right? Literally between '07 and 2015, the art market went from $35 billion to $70 billion. And I think that first paradigm shift was mobile. I think the second paradigm shift is going to be AI, that there is going to be another potential doubling with new ways of creating work, consuming work. I think we're just at day one of this cycle, mostly because when I look at Parag, your work, again, thank you for sharing, I see glimpses of Brock. I see glimpses of analytical cubism. Everyone else has their own sort of things they'll take home, but I see, like when I see the rickshaws and the little shops in Bareilly, which I've visited like maybe 15 years ago, so I get your point, but I see an art form that people wouldn't have seen it in this format until now because technology is just opening the doors today. So I think it's happening in front of our eyes.
By the way, maybe it's the first, I don't know, I should not say that, but maybe the very first time as humanity we are aware of both the birth of internet and the birth of like every single aspect of last 2 decades. And we are aware of what we are maybe saying about what's going on. So I don't know if it ever happened in the last century, so other breakthroughs, but.
Probably not at this speed, right? The communication tools were never this open ever before.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the recent hype around the supposed inevitability of a super intelligent general AI that will look like Western extractive capitalism on steroids, move fast and break everything, reflecting the culture of its creators, and essentially turn us all into paperclips. Parag, the way you've used AI in The Road to Bareilly, to name one example, as an aid in the search for identity, it shows me that this terrifying vision is not the only direction that AI can take. And I also think about work by Lauren Lee McCarthy, Tomiko Teal, Maricine Aliari, work that challenges the owner's manual, challenges our assumptions about how technology should be used to talk about our humanity. And so this leads me to my last question, where I want to look at the future. And Parag, I want to begin with you, because I know your research and teaching, you've thought a lot about how these colonial notions impact our predictions, our fears, and the limitations of what we're able to imagine AI can do. So I want to ask you first, and then open up the conversation. What's a more thoughtful future of AR that we aren't hearing about through this noise? Where else can you imagine this going? Or is there a more concerning vision you want to talk about? I want to invite you to take this anywhere you want it to go, and then I'll open up the conversation to everybody.
I'll keep it optimistic. So I think the interesting part of AI is, as we've mentioned already, like the sharing of tools and capacity to reflect on oneself and one's own kind of cultural material. I think the negative side of that is like the pure cultural extraction of material. But when you empower creators, when you empower people to use these different types of algorithms and tools for themselves and build interfaces into the kind of different weird minds of the machines and things like that, and they're able to reflect on themselves, I'm confident that the creator, artists and creators will feel more empowered. Hopefully, if they're not automated first, Sorry, I ended on a down note. No, wait. Oh, damn. Okay. Hopefully, someone else.
I think at this stage, and I'll touch upon the first thing you said, while there is some learning to be had here, I think this is science. You can't artificially stop scientific innovation, whether it's comments about whether these language models should be curtailed or stopped until we can figure out how this technology is going to work. I do think that with the speed of adoption, some of our institutional leaders will have to learn faster as well to put together regulation or rules of engagement. But that doesn't mean we should slow down everything else while they have time to learn. I think people have to learn technology as it goes. If you look at the internet cycle, right? If the 1994 Internet Act hadn't passed, we wouldn't have felt comfortable giving modems to our kids to connect to the web back in the day. I think the same analogy applies here. Like the folks who are building this technology have to collaborate and learn and put some of the regulatory practices so we can build quicker. But I think similar to my fellow panelists, I'm optimistic that this will be augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence.
I think the true challenge is like making an impact on all of our ideas and I think visions, because when there's some, I don't know, but maybe as a humans we have this tendency to not to fall, not to like hit our heads and have basic understanding of like what a reflex means. But I do believe sometimes these are sometimes very fundamental reflexes. They are not like necessarily very deep true understanding of the systems and the softwares and the hardware and its implications. But what is more challenging is like truly be able to create that very similar campfire moments, right? Because that's to me much challenging than just bringing out ideas and or concerns or problems or complications. So I think ramifications are predictable things, I think, in general. But what is much harder is like the bigger impact, which I think can only happen through enormous amount of dialogues between, in a public context. That's one of the reasons I think AI should be a public art thing before becoming a gallery, museum, or private experience. AI should not be a product and service in the first stage. It has to become an experience in life. And then I think we'll have a lot of room to discuss and learn before they are, imposed things on us. And I feel like this may be one of the hopefully joyful part for any human to play with these tools at the same time and resources and equally without any privilege and differences, I think may help.
Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of audience questions?
This is a fascinating talk, thank you. I know that some of you have been involved with Web3, and I think it's very interesting, sort of the difference between these trends of Web3, which is all about digital scarcity and ownership, and the one, and then at the same time you have, this crazy deepfake machine that's creating, replicas of everything. And I'm just very curious where you see sort of the confluence of those technologies and how you imagine kind of playing together in the near future and then maybe a little further out.
Okay, so I'll take this one given our, Christie's position on digital art and us sort of starting that whole movement in some ways in 2021. For us, I think the vision was quite clear back then that the future of web technologies, Web 3, Web 4, Web 24, was ability to be able to own digital assets, which we haven't, digital art has been a thing since Andy Warhol first got his Amiga computers in the 70s, he did create digital art, but there was no way for us to pass that on from one user to another, right? For 6 years at Microsoft, I owned the copy-paste API. I could right-click, copy, right-click, paste, and it's easy to replicate without giving a proof of ownership. So what we were excited about is the technology provided a way of giving you a provable provenance of who owns what digital asset. And regardless of what the future is, I think we all believed that, and still do in some ways, that for the generation that's growing up now, there is going to be no difference between digital and traditional, right? Again, I'll use the example of my son. He, maybe due to his father and so many screens in the home, he is digitally native. He walks up to my Apple Watch and says joke as if it's going to tell it a joke, right? He knows how to use these tools. He's not going to see a difference between art on a screen versus art in a frame that was hanging on a wall before. So I think digital technologies are evolving, and I think whether it's the use of artificial intelligence or provenance tools, we'll see acceleration of that adoption over years to come as regulation and standardization get figured out within the next decade. And that proliferation just started in 2021. So that's how we see it. Rafik?
I think the Web3 side of things are really also another mirror situation I think happened. It was a really, for anyone working with GPU computation or computer graphics, I'm pretty confident many people's mind some sort of Ethereum or something like that. That's how I just learn about the blockchain as a whole culture, but not the culture itself as what we created when we bring our artworks to the society and let it exchange between people or gifted or even donated for to charities. And also, it was, I think, incredible 2 years, but I don't believe Web3 will be a successful space without culture. I think artists and creators create a whole different perception around technology. Before it was just another economical tool, most likely an alternative to banking, but it was not necessarily a place to have conversations and discussions and other things and which exchange values beyond just tokens. But I think after artists, I think, arrived, that challenge like system, like, is it like eco-friendly? Is it like really transparent enough? Is it like exchanging better depth than gallery and museum worlds? These questions comes just after the artists arrived to the system. So I think artists brought a lot of value to the system, but the system also brought value to the artists as well. So I think it was a mutual moment for many creators that I think changed their life last 2 years.
Yeah, I'm all for artists getting paid, so that's great.
And transparently, like it's all transparently. It's very different than many other worlds of artwork, art worlds, I think.
Do we have time for another question?
Hi, thank you very much, panelists and moderation, our moderator, for a great discussion so far. I just want to build a little bit more off of the answers you just responded to, that you provided, excuse me. It seems like one of the immediate wonderful benefits, this is very on the optimistic side of forecasting, is going to be that almost anyone can start to create art, possibly even wonderful art. A small example, there was an editorial some of you may have seen last week by a Vassar professor and also an artist. His wife challenged him to come up with a new story to read, to put his children to sleep with. He was reading them stories every night. And so he generated one using some of the new generative AI tools that are out there. So what struck me was the sheer volume by which new art can get created. And you know, someone like me, terrible at drawing, no less painting, suddenly can start fooling around and have good experiences. So accepting the premise that we may have a lot more art generated, where does that put the monetization of art, setting aside the legal stuff for a second, where does that put the monetization of art, especially for hardworking artists, when supply is completely overwhelming demand? Or do you think demand can keep up with the supply in that sense?
Just one comment on that. I think it's a great question. I think that curators have a really hard job now, and it's really important to kind of view curators almost as artists in a lot of ways. I think that there's a lot of historicization and contextualization that needs to happen, and especially in this world when like everything can be generated, you know, like how do we kind of contextualize a new work of art as a result of that? We need to, I think, put a lot more work into that historicization, from my opinion.
And I think in some ways, everyone, all of us in the room, even the curators will have to sort of retool themselves a little bit to use this technology to set a level playing field, right? If artists are creating quicker and multiplying the number of works per second, I think curators will also have to get more familiar with these new technologies, whether it's the use of AI or understanding the code a little bit, and maybe get better at curating this form of art as it's coming to them, right? So it's just keeping up with the times.
I think absolutely the question really lends into the curators and institutions who are trying to give value back to the humanity through understanding this creativity. But I think it was predictable that we will question creativity for sure. We will question what is real or not for sure. But I think still I believe that just prompting, it's called prompt engineering, right? Like it's really like engineering. I think anything engineering context may not necessarily need to be immediately art. I don't believe just prompting in the most comfort zone and a billion whatever parameter latent space of potential outputs, I don't believe they may immediately become the value of the creativity. I do believe that there is still a lot of room on top of what AI can suggest, and I think we will most likely see what kind of new directions and outputs and layers and different modalities of thinking will apply right after AI's output. So my guess is whoever explores these latent spaces beyond their comfort zone will still be one of the pioneers and breakthroughs who have been exploring these nuances and problems and solutions. But also I believe that if institutions can understand these tools way quicker than the artist, they will be much more, I think, happy. Because it's really like will challenge everything, will question everything. So that will be a very fun couple of years coming.
I also just want to give credit to this panel of artists, because I think one thing that's happening right now is a lot of people are getting excited about making things with AI, with Midjourney or DALL-E or ChatGPT. And something I think when you're talking to artists who have been working with machine learning models for decades, they have the framework and the depth of experience to understand what they're looking at and what they're thinking about, and so there's not the same sort of panic and hype cycle, I think, that can happen when you have artists working with something for the very first time. So I think there's so much value to the artists here specifically, and other artists who can provide a framework for a lot of these tools. And with that, I would like to say a very warm thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the Asia Society for hosting us, and Jeffrey Deitch. And I would like to encourage you to, of course, enjoy Rafik's spectacular exhibition, and please check out more work by Parag Mital if you want to understand more about these ideas. Thank you all for being here.